Okay, good evening, everyone. Buddy's going to be bringing another lesson just a little bit. He's got the headset on, so he's ready to go. If you remember last week, we ended up talking about some guys that had gotten together here in America, and they were representing different religious groups, but they were all coming together to say, can we promote some kind of unity? In the process of that, they said, well, in order to do that, we've got to throw off our own creeds, our own doctrines that are not biblical, and just conform to be Bible-only people. And so they met in a place, and this is kind of where we went this last November. They met in a place that was called something very important. Come on. All right, I'm going to go back and hit the down button. Oh, wait a minute. Let's see if this works. Richie, where's Richie? It's called, I'll go back there and run. There's just a couple of slides. It's called the Cane Ridge Meeting House in Kentucky. And it's right now, it's still standing. The log house it's a meeting house they were meeting in. It's now been surrounded by concrete blocks or rock blocks to preserve that original structure. And anyway, this is where Buddy was talking about last time. The big revival took place, and everybody came together to say, we've got to get back to Scripture and be Bible-only people. So I'm going to show that, and then Buddy will take over, okay? All right, so I've got to go back there. For some reason, this thing's not working. Okay. Okay, that's...
Can y'all read that?
There you go. Do a narration there, buddy.
Okay, this is the original log building that they originally met in at Cane Ridge, and it was the largest log structure in America at the time. There were larger structures, but this was the largest log structure in America at the time. When you see, Jerry, you got some pictures of the inside, don't you?
Yeah, we're getting there.
This is what it's covered with that stone now. That same building you saw is inside this building. And they put this building up to preserve the logs and all of that from the original building. This is Barton Stone. This is a quote from the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery that Stone wrote. We'll talk about that when we talk about him in particular. It's interesting. It's a neat deal.
And it's just a little video of us going into it last November.
See, once you get inside there, it's a lot bigger than it looked like in that picture, isn't it? There's a balcony upstairs. I don't know if they're going to show any pictures of that or not. But there's a balcony upstairs, or there was a balcony upstairs.
Why is this not working?
Anybody have any idea what that was about? That's where the slaves. They worshipped together, but not together. The slaves were upstairs in the balcony. Yeah, you could see a little bit of it back there in that one. And that's the pulpit there that Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell and Thomas Campbell and Raccoon John Smith and many, many other big name people in the Restoration movement.
And Rick Grace and
And,
Jerry
and
Savage.
Rick Grace and
Yeah,
Jerry Savage.
We stood up there. Yes, we did.
any of the rest of you that were there probably, hopefully got up there.
There's Rick going up. How many years ago was this, buddy?
Oh, this would have been what, 17,
Yeah, right at the end. This turn of the century, 1800.
I ought to be able to recall that right off the top of my head,
Yeah.
but I can't. Y'all should have it in your notes.
Yeah, we had the curator speak to us for about half an hour and give us the history of all that. He was great. Yeah, that's the last shot.
Yeah, you can see the balcony there very plainly.
All right, it's all yours, buddy. That's the last one.
We're going to get back to this when we talk about Barton Stone, which we may start talking about him tonight. In the meantime, we're going to pick up with James O'Kelly and the O'Kelly movement. If you have should be the first thing on page 2, where it has the Methodist and the Baptist. O'Kelly was from the Methodist wing of the Anglican Church. Remember, we've talked already several times about the Baptists were reformed by the Church of England, the Anglicans, and then they were reformed by the Puritans, and then people kept not adding to, but going closer to the Bible and taking from, actually. And there were more and more groups. Well, the Methodists were one wing of the Anglican Church, which was the Church of England. That was around, 10 years or so before this camp meeting at Cane Ridge. But Kelly himself had about the same vision for how to worship, how to do church that Stone and the others would have that concerned purifying the church to the original, back to the first century church. O'Kelly was a farmer in North Carolina. He was also a preacher. In 1771, John Wesley, y'all know about John Wesley, Wesley Methodist Church. John Wesley sent Francis Asbury to the colonies from Ireland to keep watch over all of the Methodists in the United States. Make sure they were going on the straight and narrow. He became the bishop of the Methodist Church in America. Wesley wanted the Methodists to sever their ties completely with the Anglican Church. He wanted them to get completely away from them and start their own independent church, independent from them. And they did so. And about 12 or 13 years later, I think it was 1884, when they finally broke away, and they began another church, but interestingly, they called it the Methodist Episcopal Church. And Francis Asbury was the bishop. O'Kelly was at that meeting when all of that took place, when all that separation and stuff took place. He was at that meeting, but he wasn't very happy with a lot of things that took place there. He was really disappointed with a whole lot of it and opposed a lot of it. As a matter of fact, he made the statement to them. He stood up and made the statement to them that the Methodist Episcopal Church was organized by ministers for ministers. And they were the ones that were going to benefit. They were going to benefit financially. They were going to be the big shots. They were going to call all of the shots. They were going to run the whole thing. And the laity, us, the membership, was just there at their beck and call. And so that he didn't like that at all. He especially didn't like that Asbury was the head of the Methodist Church, because he'd read his Bible, and he'd read in there about one church, one faith, one hope, one baptism, one head, and that head being Jesus Christ. And so he openly said, which took some courage, he openly said, no man is the head of the church. Christ is the head of the church. And that didn't fly very well with a lot of people. This was probably about 1784. I mean 1880. I'm sorry, 1784. Anyway, what he did do, though, at that meeting, because people are people, men are men, and he was just as much a man as any of them, he accepted the position as the presiding elder for the Methodist Church in Virginia, for the Episcopal Methodist Church in Virginia. So for 8 years, he presided over 28 other preachers. Now, that sounds terrible, but really, he did it because he considered himself to be the best of the evils of their options, because he pushed for some things. And he became, to my knowledge, the first person in this history of all of this movements that are going on that pushed for the autonomy of the local church. The local church being its own government, not answering to anybody but to Christ, and running the church through what he considered to be the biblical organization of church. Elders, deacons, didn't even really consider that much about localized preachers being a part of it, because frankly there weren't a lot of localized preachers. Most of the preachers preached at 2 or 3 churches each week. And so that wasn't part of the hierarchy really. But he pushed for that. And that's important in the movement, to understand that he did that. But he continued to lock horns, of course, with Asbury and Wesley, mostly Asbury. And so eventually they withdrew altogether in 1792 from the Methodist Episcopal Church. And to the anguish, and I guess the anger of Wesley and Asbury, in December of 1793, O'Kelly and a whole bunch of those people that he had been the presiding elder of, a whole lot of them and he established another church, or started meeting together as a church in Pine Grove, Virginia. And they, in that church, took the Bible alone as their guide. They threw out the Westminster Confession of Faith. They threw out any of the creeds that were a derivative of the Nicene Creed. They took the Bible alone. And the reason they did is they said, if your argument is what's in the creed comes from the Bible, why bother? Just use the Bible. And if it's not all from the Bible, you shouldn't be using it anyway. Because Wesley, nor Asbury, nor even O'Kelly himself were the head of the church. Christ was. so just take the Bible and let's follow it. And that's what they did. They, to the best of their ability, they had some discussion about the Bible and what all it meant, but that's what they did. And for a short while, they then renamed themselves, again, the Republican Methodist Church. And about a month into it, when they separated, they had over 1,000 members. Now you may say, well, that's not much. But the population of Virginia then wasn't close to what it is today. 1,000 members in a year's time was pretty good growth, was really good growth, phenomenal growth, really. In the first year that they met, while they had all that growth, they made two really important decisions. The first one was that they would accept the scriptural way of church government. Elders as overseers of each local church, answering to Christ as the head, not to any other man. The second decision they made was they would look for a scriptural name. Because after church one day, the men were kind of standing around talking, and one of them said, "What's with this Republican Methodist Church thing?" He said, I've read my Bible, and I've read it and read it and read it and read it, and I can't find Catholic Church mentioned anywhere, Anglican Church mentioned anywhere, Methodist Church mentioned anywhere. The only Baptist I know about, they must be followers of John the Baptist rather than Christ. He said, we need a scriptural name so that when we introduce ourselves, people know who we follow. Well, there was a gentleman present that day named Rice Haggard. And Rice Haggard said, "Hey, if you want to do that, you need to be Christians. Christians. Only, to the exclusion of all other names." Now that's a big leap. And I don't know how you feel about it, but the exclusion of all other names bothers me a little bit. I understand Christian. I know that when you say you're a Christian, the world looks at you and they say you follow Christ. And that's a great thing. Nothing wrong with that. But Christian is found how many times in the New Testament? 3 times. 3 times. The one that Haggard quoted to them that day was from Acts 11 and 26, when disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. The other one is in Acts 26 and 28, when Paul is on trial before King Agrippa, and he's actually defending his apostleship before King Agrippa. And in that setting, you recall, King Agrippa said, "Paul, in such a short time, you think you convinced me to be a Christian?" Some translations say, "Paul, in such a short time, you almost convinced me to be a Christian." And the other time is in 1 Peter chapter 4, where it talks about suffering as a Christian. That's it. How many times is the word disciple used in the New Testament? How many? Anybody know? Y'all all got a phone, Google it. 117 or so. Jerry, do you know? A bunch. A whole bunch. If someone were to say, "We follow the Nazarene," most people in America today wouldn't know who the Nazarene was. But in the first century, they would know what Nazarene they were talking about, wouldn't they? So, but if they say we're disciples, everybody that follows somebody is a disciple of someone, so you have to add to it disciples of Christ. And that's eventually what happened. We became the Church of Christ, and another section became the disciples of Christ, or the Christian church. So that was a big deal, and that's why we mentioned O'Kelly and them. By 1809, the Christian church, that same church, had 20,000 members. But like I said, they debated some things about Scripture. One of the things they debated was, how does one become a member? What's the scriptural way to become a member of the church? And they had a lot of discussion about that. And I don't know that they ever agreed on that. One of the things they discussed was the why and the method of baptism. Why are you baptized? For forgiveness of sins? To receive the Holy Spirit? To be added to the church? I mean, those things were all discussed among them. The why, and then the method of baptism. That we wouldn't discuss that at all if baptizo had been translated instead of transliterated. The translation of baptizo is immersion. The transliteration is baptize. You know the difference? Instead of meaning for meaning, it's letter for letter. And so we wouldn't even have that discussion, but for all of their lives, they had sprinkled babies, for sure. And they had practiced baptism in other ways. And it's hard for us to comprehend how difficult it was for 20,000 people to come to an agreement on the why and the way of something like baptism. So they struggled with that. And I'm glad they did. Somebody had to struggle with it to start somewhere, didn't they? And so they did. But let me tell you what happens when you don't agree. You have another purification. Really, you have a separation. You have a split. So the people in that church, the Christian church, that felt like baptism scripturally was immersion, separated from those who didn't. And they were a different group, met together as a different church. The truth is, we don't really know when or where the first group of New Testament believers and practicers regularly met in America, probably. In my mind, I can easily see where a group of people isolated out in the wilderness that only had their Bibles and studied their Bibles met together on the first day of the week of each week and did what they did in Acts 2 and believed that baptism was essential to salvation. If they did all of that, who am I to say they weren't a scriptural church meeting together? We don't know about them because they didn't write it down. We don't have any written record of it. Probably in many sections there were very small groups that were doing stuff like that. But we don't know about them because there's no written record, no history of them. most likely, they were the French Huguenots that were down in Georgia. And we're not even going to talk about those guys. We're not going to talk about them because I don't know enough about them to talk about them. But they're very likely the ones that were the closest to New Testament scriptural worship in the very beginning in this country. And probably groups of them were doing exactly what I just got through explaining to you. But we don't know. They didn't write it down. Is there anything that we don't have record of that bothers you? There is me. When I read the Bible, there's some things I'd like to know that nobody wrote down. Mary. God is in the house. Write it down. What Jesus do between birth and age 12? What did he do between 12 and 30? Why in the world didn't somebody write it down? I guess we didn't need to know. But there are things like that I wish I knew that we just don't know.
Mary kept
So,
it all in her heart.
well, I know, but I don't have Mary's heart.
I know it, but when I see Mary, I'm going to ask her.
Okay. And tell her to look me up, would you? All right. I'm not trying to be sacrilegious or anything like that when I say that, but there are things that I wish we had more explanation about that we just don't. And that's that way with all history, even our American history, certainly. New England Christians, we're not going to talk much about that. We need to move on. I'm sorry. There were a couple of guys in New England as churches began to emerge in New England. They had similar goals to those in the South and in the Western frontier that we've talked about already. And a couple of those guys grew out of the Baptist churches, especially Abner Jones and Elias Smith. Jones considered Calvinism not really to be in line with New Testament thought at all. So he organized an independent Christian church too. And that was in Linden, Vermont in 1801. But his influence was pretty broad. And he became the first guy to have a lot of influence through a periodical, through a journal. Like, we read the Gospel Advocate. When I was a kid growing up, we read the Firm Foundation in Texas a lot. Any of y'all remember the Firm Foundation? Yeah. Those guys had a pretty big influence when they would talk about the why and the way of baptism, when they would talk about the Holy Spirit, when they would talk about communion, when they would talk about modes of worship. They had a pretty big influence. Well, these guys did, or he did at least. And his circulation then began to grow into the South. And when the circulation of his journal began to move into the South, the guys in the South that were believing the same way he did found out about them. And they connected. And they offered each other the hand of fellowship because they sat down and talked about what the Bible taught, and they realized they were way more alike than they were different. And they were very similar. And they were excited to know that the Christian church was way bigger than they had considered it to be. They were very excited about that. But they didn't merge with everybody. They didn't know about the Stone movement, and they didn't know about the Campbell movement, who were in operation at the time. So they didn't merge with them. But they were very, very similar to them. But it sometimes happens that didn't last. In 1931, we're pretty modern now. In 1931, they merged with the Congregationalists, the Puritans. How that happened, I don't know, but I know it happened. I mean, I can't see them having enough in common to make that happen, unless a lot of things changed over those years. But they merged with them, and they began to backtrack in theology at that point. And in 1957, they merged again with the Evangelical and Reformed Church. I'm talking about this group that were Smith, the ones that were followers of Smith and Jones, that part of that Baptist church that had joined the group from the South. So that's the they in this case that merged with the Congregationalists. Then, as recently as 1957, they merged again with the Evangelical and Reformed Church. That was when I was in the first grade. Today, they are known as the United Church of Christ, and we have almost nothing in common with them. From the standpoint of doctrine, almost nothing in common with that group. The primary thing that they do now is what caused them to ever split apart to begin with. Today they emphasize men as the heads of church way more than anybody that's deity. Just a full circle right back to where they were. All right, let's talk about our relationship with the Baptist. It's really significant. Several groups were spun off of the Puritan movement, and the Baptist was one of them. They shared the Puritans' desire to worship as a primitive New Testament church, and one prominent leader of them was a guy named John Smyth, S-M-Y-T-H, if you want to look up John Smyth. He only lived 42 years. His life was very short, but his influence was great. He had a profound influence. And we're talking a long, long, long time ago when we're talking about him, because he died in 1612, 5 years after America is America. I mean, our people are here. We're not even America yet. Yeah, it's a different way, spelled differently. He dedicated his life, though, short as it was, to the worship and ministry of the church in what he called the apostolic primitive method. Same way the apostles did in the first century. Another leader in that era, 1616, was named Thomas Helwys. I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about him, but I'm going to tell you something he said that'll say a lot. He made this statement, and it's a quote. He said, "Among all English churches, only the Baptists are the church of Christ. And only the Baptists do the way of baptism that duplicates the apostolic practice of adult immersion upon the profession of faith." See the emphasis? Infants can't profess that Jesus Christ is the Son of the one true God. that he died, that he was buried, that he was raised, and he's at the right hand of God today. Infants can't do that. So they couldn't have that confession of faith. And in his eyes, without that, they couldn't truly be baptized for the remission of their sins. And so you had to be an adult before you would even be a candidate. They were divided into two groups, the General Baptist and the Particular Baptist. The General Baptist believed in the general atonement of all mankind. That if you believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, you asked for forgiveness, you confessed, you could be baptized, and you could receive forgiveness and have salvation. The Particular Baptist, they thought that atonement was only for the elect. They held on to the Calvinistic view. God chose you before you were born. You couldn't do enough wrong to keep him from keeping you. You couldn't, and if he didn't choose you, you couldn't do enough right to be accepted. So interestingly, they, of course, didn't get along real well. They had some big differences. Although it was the Particular Baptist who pushed for following the New Testament pattern of the early church more than the others, which is ironic to me. Morgan Edwards was one of their guys. 150 years later, he published a book called The Customs of the Primitive Churches, and he wrote that every detail of the church life must have its origin in Bible and not somewhere else. But it's interesting about the things in his book. Very quickly, the things he talked about in his book was baptism by immersion, the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, every time a week had a first day. So on every first day of the week. He emphasized the laying on of hands. I don't know exactly what his emphasis was, but I know that was part of his book. He emphasized what he called the right hand of fellowship, which meant let's come together, let's have more members, let's unify with as many people as we can, let's convert some people. Let's don't try to just be our own little sect and keep people out. He was big on that. He talked about foot washing. He talked about the holy kiss. He talked about feast and fastings. He talked about one feast in particular, Love Feast. He talked about the anointing of the sick. He talked about collecting money for the poor saints. And then two other things that were in his book that he emphasized that all those good Baptists of his day followed was marriage, a marriage ceremony, public marriage ceremony, so everybody knew who your one wife and your one husband was. And that was important to him. The other was a dignified public funeral when a person died, which is interesting to me. But let me give you an example of instruction that I think is to the extreme that he taught. And that has to do with the Lord's Supper. He said it was to be taken each Lord's Day evening, because in Acts 2, that's what they did, he says. That made it scriptural. And he says, besides that, to do it at any other time of day would either make it the Lord's breakfast or the Lord's lunch. So you had to do it in the evening to make it the Lord's Supper. Now, we laugh about that, but he was dog serious about it. Okay. I'm going to skip that part. We're not going to talk about, I don't know what's on your outline there. We're not going to talk about Isaac Backus and his influence. Although it was the same as most of these others, to promote a return to primitive purity. But he did list how people departed from the biblical text. And one of the things he said was practicing infant baptism was departing. Men having a better idea than God. He's talking about creeds and confessions of faith. The use of government to advance faith. He's talking about state churches. He opposed state churches that we've already talked about and emphasized a great deal in here. He was really big on freedom in the spirit. He also was disturbed by men that he said entered into contest for preeminence. In other words, who will be the greatest in the kingdom? And he didn't like the idea of someone in the church claiming they were greater than somebody else. That was a big deal too. So, why is that important? Why is any of this important to us? When we talk about the Baptists, the separate Baptists, any of these groups. The reason it's important is because that they were located on the western frontier in Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee. It is in that area of the country where these people were that believed so much like you and I believe today, and did church so much like you and I do church today, that Walter Scott and Barton Stone and Thomas Campbell and Alexander Campbell had their greatest growth and their greatest influence. Because when they came in there, they were teaching essentially what these people had always had already come to a conclusion is the way church should be done. And so it was easy to convert them and to follow them and to join ranks with them. And the church grew immensely and in a hurry when that happened. Especially Stone. In 1811, over 13,000 people associated with the Separate Baptist joined themselves together with churches of the Stone movement in that year alone. So 13,000 of these people we've been talking about joined the Stone movement, which we haven't even talked about yet. We're going to talk about it separately because it's really important to do that. And between 1824 and 1832, 11 complete churches and 500 individual members, aside from those 11 complete churches, joined the ranks of the followers of Alexander Campbell. Now, before we move on to Stone, let's talk real quickly about the Landmark Baptist. The Landmark Baptist emerged in the mid-19th century, around 1850, in the same region where the Church of Christ had its major strength by then, and that was primarily in Tennessee. The focus for them was not on how they differed, but what they had in common. They didn't look at each other and say, you're wrong to do this, you're wrong to do that. they looked at each other and said, well, we feel that way too. Well, we believe that too. And so they were very cordial to each other, and they became good for each other. And they felt like that together they had a precise blueprint of the New Testament church. And they could devote themselves to that. And that anyone who didn't devote to their teachings needed to be visited with and studied with to be considered a member of what they thought was the true church. Now, are we any different? I mean, if you don't think you're going to the right place, aren't you still looking for somewhere else? I'm not saying if you don't believe we're the only place, but if we're not the right place, if we're doing things wrong, wouldn't you still be looking? I would. If I didn't feel like we were doing things the New Testament way, I'd still be looking for a church that was. In the late 1840s, James Graves, who was a leader of the Landmarks, he wrote this. And I want you to listen to this and see if any of it sounds familiar to you. Figure out what you agree with and what you disagree with. But he wrote this. He said, Christ founded the church and left in the New Testament a precise blueprint for its organization, worship, and practices. We humans have no rights to add to nor take from that blueprint. Any church to do so is really no church at all. And to expose them, the ones that he thought were no church at all, he asked two questions. He said, when was the church founded? And where was your church founded? And any time later than Pentecost, and anywhere other than Jerusalem, he said, no, you need to study some more. He said, that's when Christ established the church, on the day of Pentecost, in Acts 2. I think that's a little bit harsh, but at the same time, I think it's true. The Church of Christ and the Landmark Baptist differed on some details, but they were remarkably similar in most of the ways they worshiped. Remarkably similar. An example of how they differed is this. It was on how one becomes a member. Alexander Campbell said that it was by baptism. Graves said it was by vote. And each one of them used Acts 2, 40 and 41 as their proof text of Scripture. 3,000 added that day. They both used the same text as their proof text. So people are people. And we still are today. We sit down and we look at the Bible and we study it and we have discussions. We have discussions in our Bible classes about, what is the right way to do certain things. And we don't all agree, even in our Bible classes here. We might not hold up our hand and say, hey, I don't agree with that exactly. We might, but we might not. But we don't all agree on everything. And we're not going to. Or at least we haven't for all these years. So the important thing is, as these people learned, you have to learn to respect each other. You have to learn to love each other. You need to go to the New Testament to find your answers. But you absolutely need to do your own study. You don't need to let somebody else study for you. That's how churches became all these different denominations to start with. Allowing somebody else to study for you. That doesn't mean if you have a question about something, you can't ask. If Wes has a question, he's comfortable going to Randy Reed and asking him, Randy, what do you think about this? I'm sure there are people that if Randy has questions, he's comfortable going and saying, hey, how do you feel about this? But if they don't feel exactly the same way you do, you don't have to go home mad. You don't have to divide. Some things are absolute doctrinal truth that have to be stood upon. We don't divide over doctrine. We really don't. We divide over opinions. Those people that divided over doctrine, they've already done that. We've talked about them. There's just not, most of the things we divide over are not that important. I'm not saying nothing is that important. I'm just saying we need to respect each other's study. But don't let somebody else study for you. There's not a person in this facility that's not smart enough to do their own study. And certainly I know I teach things that people don't all agree with all the time. Having said that, let me say this. I hope you understand how incredibly lucky you are that on Sunday mornings when you come here and you go to Bible class, you have some very sound, good, doctrinal, great, hard-working people that make preparation for the class they teach. Be thankful. Be thankful for Kirk. Be thankful for Randy. Be thankful for Jerry. Be thankful for all of you that do that teach. Folks, that isn't the case everywhere. I've gone to churches before and went to adult Bible classes, and the guy got up at 7 o'clock that morning and did his study between 7 and 8. I can promise you that's not the way Randy Reed prepares for a class. We are blessed. We really are. And you need to tell those guys, thank you. Thank you. But if at any point you don't agree with them, after class, walk over there and put your arm around them and say, hey, let's talk about this. I don't see it that way. Help me understand it. And then you don't get mad and you don't divide and things go well. You understand how important all that is? Okay. We're going to stop tonight. Next week, we're going to start with number 3 in the outline. And we're probably going to spend a week on Barton W. Stone, and a week on Alexander Campbell, and a week on Thomas Campbell, and the guys that work closely with them. And then I plan to spend a week talking about the church during the Civil War. Folks, that is an interesting study. Can you imagine what it was like going to church in Missouri or one of the border states where you had guys sitting in a Union uniform and a guy sitting in a Confederate uniform singing the same songs of praise, praying the same prayers, listening to the same preacher? and then the next day you're out there trying to kill each other, literally trying to kill each other? Yeah, on the border states, they really did that.
They went to church together.
Yes, they're border states, you were not Confederate, you were not Union, you were Confederate and Union. You chose your side. And that happened in families. Brothers fought brothers, sons fought dads. If we have time, we're going to tell a story about James Garfield's college kids. He was the president of Hiram University, and he was commissioned as a colonel, and he recruited all the kids from his college to be in the Union Army. And they met a group that had gone to Bethany College who were from Virginia on the battlefield. That'd be like a group of kids from Abilene Christian meeting a group of kids from Oklahoma Christian on the battlefield trying to kill each other. Can you imagine the horrors of that? We're going to talk about that a little bit. And we're going to talk about how that divided the North and the South church significantly, and quite frankly, it's still today. Part of what still does today. And then we're going to talk 1 week about Texas. We're going to talk about the church on wheels that some of you are descendants of either the Despains or the Matthews or some of those guys on that wagon train that go to church right here today. We'll talk about the formation, the beginnings of TCU. You know where TCU started? Anybody know? Right out here by Aguilar Cemetery. About 40 kids. Then it moved to Waco. Then it moved to Fort Worth. And finally it was changed, the name was changed to Texas Christian. Began as Adran College, Addison and Randolph Clark. I hope we have time to talk about all of that, but that's my plan. And so, I don't know if you've enjoyed it up to this point, but I promise you it's going to get better. Okay, thank y'all so much. Thank you.